what I'm going to tell you today in our little lecture is not how to avoid things going wrong, but how to take that in your stride and make your audience assume that you remain in control. This is the most important thing. Now, the art of public speaking, and as you can see from here, the science of oral argument, because there's both an art and a scientific aspect in what we will be talking about today. And we will be talking about talking. We will be trying to get the most important aspects of various areas of public speaking and put them together in several chapters that will come useful, and hopefully it will be a point, it will boil down to 2 or 3 points that you will remember and have something to relate to. As you have seen, the majority of successful people can communicate well. There are few successful people, such as poets or some artists, that tend to be incommunicative. And still, the way that they become successful is because of what they have written, or what they have painted, and what they have produced. For the majority of us who do not possess such talents, the only way that we can get across to the rest of humanity is through our writing and through our vocalizations, commonly known as speech. We are not going to deal with the writing today at all. We are going to just be speaking about voice, about speech, about language. It is very important for you to realize that what you are going to hear today is not applicable just in one language. It's not applicable to English. It makes no difference whether your mother tongue is Russian, Greek, English, or Urdu. It will be equally applicable, the things that we're going to hear today, to everything that encompasses vocalizations. Now, it's not just talking. We have to communicate, and the reason we are here, what the part of communication that we'll be talking about today is communication to convince and be appreciated. Because talking and speaking in public can have several forms. I could be speaking to entertain you. I could be reading poetry. I could be acting. This is not what we will be covering today. There's a different set of parameters that have to deal with oral interpretation or acting and such other different ways of communication. We will be talking about presentations, we will be talking about public lectures, we'll be talking about political lectures, we will be talking about impromptu speaking, interviews. That's the kind of skills that we will cover today. Now, when we are defining public speaking, the majority of you will immediately say, if requested, that the most important thing that you will have to deal with is the content of your speech. Yes, of course, if you stand up and talk rubbish, no matter how well you have said it, it will still be rubbish. Psychological tests, however, that have been conducted for the last 80 years or so fairly consistently, have shown that over 50% of an oral message is communicated visually. And what I mean now by visually is not this, it's this. Believe it or not, this is what you're currently absorbing. And it's not me who says this. This has been a consistent result of psychological tests over the last few decades. As you have seen, the verbal is only 7%, the vocalization is 36%, and then the visual, the body language, the eye contact that I'm having with you, the ways that I move my hands, my facial expressions, the way I'm dressed, the way I move up and down, all this represents 57%, more than half of the information. So let's see. You want to prepare a speech. You want to prepare a lecture, an interview, like I have just had today. I come here to you and I have prepared, obviously, a lecture on public speaking, and just a few minutes ago I was giving an interview to a Russian newspaper, Vedomosti. Two completely different things. Two completely different reasons to prepare, and a different set of skills that you will need in order to do this properly. So, I will describe the whole set of rules, and I will tell you, as we come to that, partly what I did in order to get this organized. Before then, as they say, if you can look it up, you can read books about public speaking, you can read, there's internet websites about public speaking. There's quite a lot of information about it. Unfortunately, like most information publicly available, they will not tell you some of the real inside tips, the down and dirty. You will hear quite often that you have to prepare. Yeah, sure. Preparation is extremely important. If you're going to come up and give a lecture about Marxist economic theory, you'd better know what you're talking about. If you're going to come up and talk to the newspapers about the sanctions of Russia and against Russia in what regards the Ukrainian situation, you'd better be quite au fait with the subject matter. Otherwise, there's no point. It all becomes just a hollow speech. Knowing your subject matter will make you confident, as these books say. Well, the reality is that it will probably make you confident. And the reason for the probably is that you need more than simple preparation in order to appear confident in your speech. Plus, you can be confident in your public speaking even with zero preparation. And that is an important skill. It is a talent, some people are born with it, but it is also a skill that can be learned. And more about this later. An audience like you tends to receive a message that is contained in your speech often much better if they realize, or if they think, or if you fool them enough to think that you have prepared that speech quite adequately. In general, As in most things that we do in our lives, in interaction with other human beings, we conform to social and psychological expectations, and we transmit these expectations as in a kind of mirroring situation. Therefore, if your audience believes or feels that you're the expert or you have been well prepared, then you have already taken an important step into convincing them. What do you want to do? First of all, what's the objective? Are you trying to inform people? What am I trying to do now? Of the 4 aspects, of the 4 points that I have put up here, now I am informing you. Just before, I was trying to, with talking to the newspapers, I was trying to inform the newspapers, but ultimately I was trying to persuade who? The readers of the newspaper, because the interviewers were just the medium through which the information was coming out. If I had a smaller group, and I am happy to see that I have some of my former public speaking students in the audience today, if I had a smaller group, then I would be training you. I would be using the same information in a different way so as to train you in public speaking. And if I was singing and dancing, then I would be trying to entertain you. You always have to think, as part of your preparation, what is the message that you would like your audience to take away with them. Which brings us to the second part of the before stage. The audience. Who is your audience? What are they? And what is their background? Right now, I know that my audience is mostly students, almost exclusively Russians, English speaking and understanding to a large extent, and educated. These are the assumptions I have made through the appointments that was asked from me, and I realized that I'm giving a guest lecture in Moscow at Plekhanov University, so Russian students are to be expected, some foreign friends and colleagues, and also some academics, some Russian academics, colleagues of mine, possibly some members of the press. Maybe, although I do not consider myself that important enough, maybe 1 or 2 spies and service operatives, intelligence operatives. How many people will be attending? I asked that. I asked, how large is the room going to be? And they said, quite large. True. There we are. How many people? Response, we'll see. You have to play these things by ear in order to get to grips to what you will have to communicate and how. The what, I had it in advance. Now, the presentation I would be making and would be to a certain extent different if I was going to speak in a smaller room to a smaller audience. And of course, it would be rather different if I knew that you were native speakers of English, or perhaps if I knew that you were not speaking English at all. I could do that in French or German then. These ideas come, of course, you'd say, well, it's natural that you would, but I'm trying to make you realize that conforming and addressing your audience is an extremely important consideration. Sometimes we just do it naturally, but it is so much better if you sit back and reflect on this. What do they need to know? What do they already know? Well, certainly they already know a few things. They have had exposure to media, they watch television, they can read and write. So obviously they do know quite a few things about public speaking. You do not need to stand up and tell them, oh, you know, you have to string 2 sentences together in order to convince your audience. They will need something more than that. What do they expect? Do they expect to be entertained? Well, perhaps a little bit, but I would expect that they would need to be informed. They would need to know. And how would they take your message, reception of your message? Here, overall, I would hope positive. There may well be situations where you would be encountering a negative audience. Political speeches, court speeches, and other such situations are examples of this. After having reflected on your audience, then you should obviously think about the contents of the speech. What is the most relevant and the most appropriate? I have been deciding this when I put together my little presentation, which forms the skeleton of my main line of argumentation. If you have not done this before, then this is the time to do your research. A very important tip, something that I see public speakers, whether they would be academics or even budding politicians or someone like that, or just people who want to do something as simple as a corporate presentation. Don't give too much information. Better keep it short, sharp, and sweet. Essentially, and by the short, doesn't mean just these, as they say, 10 minutes only, or 15 minutes only. You do have a slot to fill. You ask, how long do I need to speak? They will tell you. This is how it usually works. You read all sorts of silly advice by people and so-called experts telling you, oh, well, yes, nobody has an attention span of more than 10 minutes, and after that they start thinking of their first love, or what is their wife going to cook them for dinner, and all this. That's all very good, that's brilliant, but you know what? Life doesn't work like this. If you're a lecturer, as simple as that, they tell you, look, you have a 1.5 hour block, you go there and teach. What are you going to tell the dean? Sorry, you know, my students do not have an attention span more than 10 minutes, so I'm going to speak for 10 minutes, and after that I'll let them play with their Legos. What? So, we forget all these attention span things. We all speak by slots. I was asked today, listen, you have, how much time do I have? This time. I'm supposed to be good enough and interesting enough to keep you hopefully awake and even better interested for the whole of this time. So forget about all these time limitations. However, be selective. Don't tell them everything. Plus, another tip from me, if you tell them everything, they're not going to call you back. So if you want to be requested kindly again to give a follow-up, then you should retain a few bits and pieces of information to yourself. Structure. Well, very interesting. Introduction, a body, and a conclusion. You see, at the beginning, I did make an introduction. For the ones who have not noticed, now we are in the main part of the presentation. It is good not to give a dry academic speech, but to be able to make it always more fascinating by using some stories, some example, some figures, numbers, percentages. I just did at the beginning, remember? Humor. Humor, especially this is quite culture dependent. There are cultures where telling a joke would go down well and would actually even be considered essential, and there are cultures where you might be well advised to avoid it. So if perhaps I was in Britain or North America, yes, I would be saying, you actually get all these, again, these self-help books always start with a joke. Doesn't work very much in Russia. Depends on the setting, of course, but, continental Europe either. Have you ever heard the German Chancellor starting her speech with a joke? Doesn't go down well. Neither goes it with the French. So it may be useful, but you have to be very clear with this. And of course, if you overdo it, this will reflect very badly. So caution is advised. Do not lose your audience in your structure. Do not let them misunderstand what you're trying to tell them. Keep on returning to the fact that we are here for one specific purpose, and that specific purpose is for you to listen to me about the art of public speaking. Keep on returning to this. It's very important for your audience to know that there is one line, one thread going throughout from the first moment you speak until the very last, and of course you could be saying some things on the side, some stories, some anecdotes, perhaps even a couple of jokes, but it is all related to this thread. Do not let the audience lose the main idea of your talk. Finally, now more about structure. The structure should be simple, the sentences should be short, and use concrete words. If you notice, if you were actually taking stenographic notes of what I'm saying, you would see that I try to avoid using complicated words as well as complicated sentences. Not because I cannot, I'm a lawyer after all, I can be extremely complicated in the way that I say things, but that would not help me. Not in this situation, not with this audience. So, concrete as opposed to abstract meanings in most situations are easier to understand. Another very important thing, many of you forget this. You have done most of these things, you have thought about what you're going to present, you use easy words, good presentation skills and all this, but you do not let the audience understand how your presentation flows, what the direction is. And this can be done both by vocal cues, pauses, or saying, well, now we're going to speak about the second or the third chapter. Could be done by visual cues, well, you see, 4, structure. Or it could just be done by saying, by giving a handout. Very important for the audience to understand at each time where they are and what's your direction. Let me give you another tip of experience here as well. If you decide to use PowerPoints, then it is a very good idea to have on the first, or let's say on the first page, you are going to put who you are, your title, your name, and the topic of your presentation. Then, as soon as you have moved up to the stage and the audience has absorbed this information, you move on to your second page. And your second page is a one-page outline of what you're going to talk about in 5 or 6 headings. And while you start or even before you start, while you're being introduced, for example. And then you go through your first joke. Yes, I'm so happy to be here. I appreciate your invitation. Then that stays with the audience for 1 or 2 minutes, so they absorb consciously and a bit subconsciously what you will be talking about. Finally, rehearsal. If you are not used to doing this, it's good to take a bit of time to rehearse. And this is extremely important if you are asked to... The presentation we're talking about is something that is part of a very formalized occasion, such as a competition, a debate or rhetorical competition, things like Jessup's Telders that exist for lawyers and for others. Yes, then you would be rehearsing, and rehearsing all the time. On the other hand, if your job at some point involves a lot of public speaking and presentations, either talking, for example, as I did, just bringing today, if I was going to be rehearsing every time I would speak in a classroom, or even every time that I would be asked for a commentary, whether that would be a formal interview or not, then I would probably have to give up sleeping. There's just not enough time. There comes a certain stage, there should come a certain stage, where it would come naturally to you. But before you reach that stage, and in order to do this and achieve it properly, you should rehearse. If this is not the kind of very formalized situation that I mentioned before. Second step. We have done our rehearsal, we have done our reading, we have done our writing, and now the important moment comes up, and we need to present. And there are 5 items, again, in the second step that you need to take into consideration. Most people tend to be quite nervous when they speak. They say, I have read that in the United States, supposedly, the fear of public speaking is second only to the fear of death. My response to that is rubbish. No one is so much afraid of public speaking. There are much more horrible things that can happen to you. And in reality, although some of us are born with the incredible gift of being charismatic and natural public speakers, the majority of the rest of us can learn and can train themselves to overcome their nervousness. One little tip that could be useful is to speak more slowly during the first few moments of a talk. Rapport. Rapport means the relationship between the speaker and the audience. Have you noticed something? I hope so. Eye contact. I have tried to make eye contact with every single person in this audience. Fleetingly, at least. Much easier with the people sitting in the front rows, but it can happen even with parts of the audience that may be quite distant. Why I'm doing this? Because you feel that I speak personally to you. And then it is psychologically, this contact, this rapport is established as soon as you see that I look you in the eyes when I speak to you. And then the empathy, this social empathy, which covertly happens, starts being realized, and you become much more accepting to what I have to say. at the same time, I am being responsive to your reactions. I cannot really do it now, but if I was in a smaller classroom teaching and I could see that some of you were not paying attention or playing with your mobile phones, I would actually have a response to this, and I would actually stop you. I would actually not allow you to continue. This is what I mean. That's at the very basic level, being responsive. Obviously, if you're giving a formal speech or a lecture, or you're giving an interview in television, you cannot go and say, sorry, you there, you are not supposed to be sending an SMS to your boyfriend right now. This is not acceptable. Then you have to use your backup tricks, whereby you should use voice or content or specific gestures to regain the attention of the audience. Third, body language. You remember before we said 57% of the message is in fact communicated by non-auditory means, by visual means. So, the way that you convey your ideas is extremely important. You should not distract your audience by moving too much, but then you should not remain fixed in one spot either. Because this is one of the best ways to bore your audience and lose their attention. The fact that, as you have seen, I am pacing, but what I mean by pacing, I'll give you an example of what it says there, pacing. It says, you should not be doing this, because obviously it would show that you are nervous, and the fact that I do not have eye contact with any of you, and I'm pacing up and down, I look exactly like a crazy professor who are the ones who have thinking of atomic bombs and dark energy and the Big Bang and all that, and I have completely lost you, and you have no idea what I'm talking about, and you're not interested at all. This is not what I'm doing, and this is not what you should be doing. That's the pacing. On the other hand, do not remain in one spot the whole time. If you can, I was giving a television interview just before. You can imagine that if I suddenly stood up with all the cables trailing from me and said, well, you know, in order to keep your attention now, I have to take a few steps left and right. So, play it by ear, be sensible. I hope there is enough common sense in you in order to understand what I'm talking about. Gestures. And you see, when it says open-handedness, you see that I open my hands to you. I do not, unless I have a specific message to convey, fold my hands on my chest. And I point towards you every now and then. This comes subconsciously. I do not any longer control it. This has become like driving. These are automatic things. But you, as the audience who are looking at me, you should be observing the body language. Vocal quality. We did say that vocalizations carry 36% of our message. We are talking about the volume, and we did have, you see, a little problem about the volume before. Let me give you now another practical tip. If you can help it, speak without a microphone. That would not be possible to do here. It would be actually possible for me, and you could hear me, but it would not be sustainable. I would not be able to last for more than 3 minutes. However, I could speak for about 3 or 4 minutes, loud enough, not screaming, projecting from my diaphragm, that I could be heard. Unfortunately, I have a longer time slot to fill. That is why we had to rush with the microphones at the beginning. If, however, you are in a room that is easily and manageably covered by your own voice without having to stress it too much, then prefer it. Natural here is always better. No kind of advanced audiovisual installation is going to make up for the tone of your natural voice emanating from one particular place. Plus, there's something else. We are psychologically cued to receive auditory signals from one particular area, and then subconsciously our brain is trained to focus attention to that part, to that place around us where the auditory signals originate. Therefore, our brains find it ever so slightly confusing when we have the speaker in front of us who is presenting, talking, saying about something, and the auditory signals arrive behind us, as is happening here. One of the reasons then that I insist that you should try to avoid using microphones is in order to be able to avoid this kind of discrepancy in the brain's understanding of what and where it should be paying attention. Tone and pitch and tempo. We will speak more about voice very shortly, but for now it is extremely important for you to remember that all of this should be varied. And if you pay attention, I do this all the time. Finally, question time. This will come later on, if the dean allows. And when you're being asked a question, pay attention to the person who asks you the question. Don't look away, don't look in the sky, don't look at your watch. Nod in approval. It establishes a bit more of rapport, even if you completely disagree. If you have not heard the question, misunderstood it, or even if you have understood it, it's always very good to paraphrase it, because A, it allows you to avoid mishearing and start answering something else, unless you're a politician, in which case you should be answering something else. And B, it gives you a few more seconds to think about your answer, because you can multitask on your brain. Answer shortly and simply, and I say mostly because sometimes it is in your interest not to answer shortly, because perhaps you want to avoid further questions, and not to answer simply because you're a politician and you need to fudge the issue. So I say mostly, depending again in the context. Now, I'm often being asked, what do I do, sir, if I do not know the answer to a question? Mostly, the best way here is the honest way. There are ways, there are certain particular turns of phrase which can tell you, with which you can tell your audience that you are not exactly aware of the answer to this particular question that they're posing. There would be some situations where this would not be acceptable or would not go down very well. In such situations, you have to try and get from your audience or from the person asking you some more cues. And I will tell you a couple of these tips very shortly. Now, this was the basics so far. Let's now do some advanced analysis. And this is the third and last part of my presentation. Remember, we said this is an art and a science. And an art you have to master, and the science you have to understand. Let's look at the art now. I will be repeating some of the points I raised in the previous two parts in order to look at them in further depth. Remember that the purpose of your talk would be context dependent, and we explained how you are supposed to react in every situation like that. Always take into consideration the expectations of your audience and the settings in which you will be asked to speak into. Your audience, as we said, are the ones that will dictate to you the kind of message and the contents of the message, more importantly. We speak differently to different people of different ages, of different sex, of different political persuasions, of different ethnic origin. Quite often, telling a story gives you a double bonus. On one hand, it makes you more human to the audience, and on the other hand, it has been proven that what we usually retain from speeches are such little anecdotes, stories. It is not by chance that since ancient times we have seen that messages were conveyed through stories. Aesop's fables and the parables of Jesus Christ are the best known examples where a philosophical or moral message is being conveyed through packaging in little memorable stories. Otherwise, if Jesus Christ was standing up and making a very deep philosophical, analytical conversations, it is unlikely that the illiterate fishermen of Galilee would give him so much time and consideration. Feedback to the listener, from the listener. You should see how they react to you. You should see whether they still pay attention to you. And of course, if you see them shocked and indignant, perhaps you have done something wrong. Or if you are there in order to offend them, then you're doing the right thing. Speech delivery. How do we deliver speeches? What am I doing now? I have put 4 ways that you can deliver your speech. One thing that you should try not to do is to read from a manuscript. You only do that when it is absolutely necessary. For example, you are the president of the court who announces a decision. In that case, every word, every sign of punctuation counts. Then you should be reading. Or you are a newscaster, in which case you do not read from a paper, you read from a machine which runs the subtitles before you so that you are seen to be having eye contact with the audience. And again, you cannot start changing things because even one word, even a comma, even a punctuation might give a completely different slant. Other than that, do not read anything from a manuscript. You could recite from memory. I have seen this happening on a few occasions, not more than half a dozen in my life. Very few people can do it, and very few people can do it effectively. I do not have this kind of memory, especially not with the kind of speeches that I'm delivering to you right now. Some people might do it, and if we're talking, because they have the skills, and if we're talking about something short that you would like to memorize, then so be it. But if you decide to go down this way, or you have to, then rehearsal there is extremely important. Speaking with no preparation, impromptu speaking, as we say in English, is another item that we should be doing. You should avoid this while you're learning, but inevitably you will come across this. If you are giving an interview to the media, even if they have given, the media have supplied a couple of questions to you in advance, they will always surprise you with a few impromptu questions. If you are addressing students, the students have not, you have not rehearsed any questions with them. They can ask you anything. So this will inevitably come up at some point. If you are an expert public speaker, that's great. If you're still learning, you will be very scared, but there are ways that you can plan ahead in order to minimize the impact of this. The way that I'm speaking now is the fourth way. I am speaking extemporaneously. I know what I'm talking about. I have a few notes in front of me. Right now, they are in the form of a visual presentation, but as you can see, I do not read out of it. As you can see, I can actually change the order, and nothing wrong will happen because I'm sufficiently comfortable with it. I have had some preparation with it, and of course it is the whole concept of me talking to you about oral skills and arguments. If my own oral skills and art of argument was not good enough to deliver at least an extemporaneous version of my speech, would be a rather ironic situation. How do you organize your speech once you have started it? You should use transitions. A transition in English now is, but they exist in all languages, are the words like besides, not only, that you use in order to show that you have moved on. This is the equivalent of the paragraph mark if you were seeing a written paper, if you were reading a book. One thing that I use quite often is this phrase that I have put here. This brings me on to the next topic. That shows you that we are turning the page. That's the equivalent. It's very important that when you move on to the next page, you take your audience with you. So that brings me on to the next topic, internal previews. Tell your audience in advance what you will be talking about next. I've done this already 3 times in my speech so far. And that means you have already started filling in the blanks of my presentation as a structure in your minds. I also repeat things. I say, let me reiterate, let me repeat what I just said a few minutes ago. And I use signposts. Remember, I told you first stage preparation, second stage delivery. Preparation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I use this both visually and as part of my presentation. And you know what? It works. Now you know what I'm talking about. Plus, you know what direction I'm moving in, and you are aware of where this is going. Probably even how long it's going to take. And when question time comes afterwards, it will be much easier for you to refer to what you want to remember, and even let me understand which parts of my presentation you want to ask a question for. Do you know how many times audience asks you for something that they have not understood correctly, something that they have not perhaps heard correctly, or a piece of information, and you don't really know which part of the speech, of your speech, they refer to? You do not understand where and when you heard such a thing. If you break it down easily for them, and it's well organized, then they can tell you, well, you know, when you were saying in the part of organizing a speech, of delivering a speech, the third part where you were saying about voice, you say, okay, I remember that. Things you should not do. As we said, don't read directly from your notes. Don't read directly from your screen. You can refer to your screen. As you can see, I'm not reading from this. Don't turn your back on the audience and try and see, oh yes, oh, what does it, turn your back on the audience, sorry. Yeah. I don't put my hands in my pockets, and I do not slouch, and I have an open body posture. This is a big problem in all languages for everyone. Ums, ahs, you knows, like, these things that, of course, this is in English, but you have the equivalent in Russian, in French, in every language. You need to train yourselves to avoid this. You use this, all of us do, and the only way to avoid this is sit down, take your camera, start talking, speak for 10 minutes on something that you have prepared, see how many times you've said it, and then realize when and why you say it, and avoid it. Don't make nervous gestures. Don't talk too fast. Don't talk too quietly. What you should do instead is maintain eye contact. Glance at your notes, which I'm doing now. Of course, I could just as well be using written notes as I was using before. Make the appropriate gestures that we talked about, and ask rhetorical questions that keeps the audience involved. In what regards now the vocalizations that we're talking about, the volume is something that I brought up before. Always try to be loud, but sometimes there are situations where you have to speak softly. If anything, because first of all you have to change your tempo and vary the volume, and number two, because if you suddenly start speaking after a few loud seconds, if you start speaking softly, you will bring back counterintuitively the attention of the audience towards you. The pitch should not be constantly high or constantly low, because otherwise this will be monotonous. Pauses are the best way for you to avoid ums and ahs. Pronunciation, especially in a foreign language, is extremely important. Articulation, saying words clearly and not mumbling and eating half of them, is very important. As for your voice, breathe regularly. It's always a good tip is when you start your presentation to take a deep breath for two reasons. Because first of all, it makes you relax. It diminishes your heart rate. It diminishes your blood pressure. Plus, it has another unexpected result. It makes your voice slightly deeper. It brings it down in pitch. And it has been scientifically proven that we respond as human beings to lower voices as being more authoritative and certainly easier to relate and understand and learn from them. So, always a deep breath before you start. If you have an engaging voice, then you end up with an engaging presentation. People, students, audiences ask me quite often, how do I train my voice? Well, the best voice training, believe it or not, is singing. You could do that professionally. Professional. Go to professional trainers. Or you could just do your favorite karaoke, sit at home, take your camera again, and start singing loudly, not softly, one of your favorite songs. This is very good voice training. Body language. You need to vary your body language, as we have said before. Because if you repeat your gestures, then you end up having a monotone impression on your audience, the same way that your voice can cause a monotone impression. Again, practicing is a very good way that you could do this, and filming yourself. We talked about the face, about eye contact being the most important thing that you can have with your audience, and you should maintain it. You should establish it and maintain it. And you will smile if appropriate. You will not going to smile if you deliver a eulogy in someone's commemoration service, but you may need to smile in other appropriate circumstances. That builds subconscious rapport. Also, your face should look engaged. If you are the first one who looks bored with what you're doing, then your audience will follow you in their boredom. Structure. Remember we said about structure being extremely important. The cardinal reason for oral presentation is tell them what you're going to tell them. Then tell them. And third, tell them what you just told them. It sounds rather self-fulfilling, but in reality, quite a few people forget to do this. They forget at the beginning to set the structure of, you know what, this is what I'm going to talk to you about. And then they forget, then they tell you what they're after, and then in the third round, they forget to actually reiterate what they talked about. Depending, again, on the situation, talking about an anecdote or a rhetorical question wakes them up. Addressing your audience, such as, why are you there just chatting amongst yourselves most of the time, is a way to wake them up. And also, you should be using the signpost structure used by having these headings and subheadings that we mentioned before. Your introduction and your conclusion should not be more than 2 times 15% of the most, so about 1/3 of your whole argument. Now, concluding, we are going to look at the science. We'll be looking at the arts, and we do have a few items of science. Do I have your undivided attention? Good. Let's keep it this way. Do not be afraid of pauses. Pauses are your friend. Right now that I have paused, the subconscious way that, the subconscious thing that I have achieved is twofold. First of all, I have managed to give you the impression that I'm moving on to another chapter. And I have also made everyone aware that these two young ladies keep on talking to each other, and because I paused, everyone can hear them, and hopefully they will realize that this is so and become embarrassed and stop doing this. So pauses are your friend. And we also said that pauses are helping you to avoid the ums and ahs. What happens if you lose track of your presentation and you forget? Well, in that case, if you have already used a few pauses, these pregnant pauses, then your audience will most likely not understand that this time you're using a pause simply because you have forgotten what comes next, but they will think that this is another one of your rhetorical little tips and tricks. So one more reason why psychologically pauses can be very helpful. Never, almost never, apologize to your audience. One of the surest ways to lose your audience's attention is what we hear quite often, especially in academic theaters, in conferences, where we have our colleagues putting up their hands and starting their speech, their intervention, by saying, well, excuse me, I'm not really an expert on this, but, in nuclear science, but what I have to say is blah, blah, blah. You know what? As soon as the audience has heard the first sentence, I'm not really an expert on this, but, from the but, they've just switched off and they go back and play with their mobile phones. Don't apologize. If, of course, for reasons of decency and humility, at some point, you need to convey a message that you are not as well read or as well versed or as well prepared as the rest of the audience, because let's assume now that you really do find yourself in a conference of nuclear scientists and you don't have the foggiest idea about nuclear science, and you want to say something. How do you do that? Do you know? Well, let me tell you. You don't say, sorry, I'm not a nuclear scientist and I have no clue, but, because as we said, this is the wrong thing. However, the way to say it is, well, ladies and gentlemen, obviously, there are many of you here who are much more experienced in this than some of us. It would be very important for a third-party voice to be heard. What did I just do? Instead of apologizing for my ignorance, I turned this on its head and I made a compliment to my audience. When you compliment people, you prep their ears up. They like it. We all like it. So instead of saying, sorry, I'm worthless in this because you're the experts, I just said, you are the experts, you know much more than I do, but sometimes it's also good to hear a third-party view. So you put yourself in the position of someone who knows not so much about this subject matter as they do, but you are a disinterested third party, as we say in psychology. So that's the best way that you want to do this. Finally, fear of public speaking. Who, be honest, here is afraid of speaking in public? Please raise your hands and keep them up. Please do. Thank you very much. Who is not afraid of public speaking? Raise your hands. Well, I can see that my colleague, and some of my students. I hope that this has been, at least to a very tiny extent, I have contributed to this diminishing of fear. But jokes apart. Yes, we all have a fear of public speaking, but there are ways, both in the art of it and in the science, to control this communication apprehension. This anxiety is a universal phenomenon. There are very few people who are born without this communication apprehension. What are the symptoms? It has physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. And like dogs who smell fear, humans can also smell public speaking apprehension. If you know what to avoid, then you are in a much better position to control it. So, final, criticism. What happens if, depending on the circumstances, probably not in an academic lecture, but let's say you are part of a political debate, and someone stands up, well, perhaps not necessarily here in Russia, but in England, one of the great British traditions we have is heckling. What happens if you are accosted by the heckler? A, never make it personal. Most probably you represent something for the heckler. Whether that would be obviously a different point of view, whether that would be a different nation, whether that would be a different political party, whether that would be a different gender. You represent something. So 98% the heckler would not be necessarily targeting you in particular. Even if they do in that 2%, don't take it personally, because that will not, you know what will happen then? You will lose empathy with your audience. If you disengage yourself from the heckler and you retain yourself the empathy that you have hopefully managed to gain, the rapport with some of your audience, then you are going to end up on the winning side. You should also try to use the lowest common denominator in order to get the audience, or at least part of it, on your side, or in order at least not to make them too negative towards you. If someone does try to disrupt your very important speech, there are ways of dealing with this. One of them is to actually say, that's very good, tell us about it. Sometimes hecklers, people who disagree, just want to be heard. Everyone has the need to be heard. Everyone feels that they have the right to voice their grievances. And sometimes, if you just allow them to let off steam, they feel much better. If someone doesn't heckle you, but asks you a very awkward question, and you're not even certain of the response, or perhaps you are certain of the response, but you do not want to answer it, or you shouldn't be doing this, a way of avoiding this is to pass the buck. Ask the audience to help you to respond to this question. Another way that politicians use most of the time is to sidetrack the discussion. So pretend you're answering, but in fact, instead of answering, as most politicians do, say something that you have already prepared on your own and that has to do with how you view things without answering the question at all. A timed honor trick. Finally, another way, but you have to be very good at this, is to mock them with gentle irony. If you can do this very well, then this can be one of the most entertaining things that you can offer to your audience. A great and well-accomplished mocker of hecklers was the late British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. There is a well-known anecdote where he's speaking during the Vietnam War, the beginning of the 70s, and he's talking to, he's having in his constituency in Britain a political meeting, and he's talking about the spending patterns of Her Majesty's government. So he starts saying, yes, we will be spending money on schools and hospitals. Suddenly, there's this hippie with a beard and flowers, a shirt and all these, who stands up at the back of the audience and interrupts the Prime Minister and sounds, "What about Vietnam?" Harold Wilson turns to him in a very affable and Olympian way and responds, "Her Majesty's government has currently no plans to extend spending in opening hospitals and schools in Vietnam." That's very good. The audience laughs for the irony, and then Harold Wilson continues. Goes on about the spending. In 1 minute, the same heckler stands up and says, "Rubbish!" And Harold Wilson responds, "Sir, I will come to your particular point of interest right after I finish my speech." I hope that this has been of relative use to you, and I would be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.